You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
We've talked about useful fiction on the show before, and that's all fiction intelligence, as some of our keen listeners talk about looking into the future and seeing how fiction can be used to devise an understanding of future conflict. We've also talked about some historical art forms, such as graphic novels about historical units. The Harlem Hellfighters is one example by Max Brooks. So we haven't quite covered historical fiction yet. And I know there's a lot of historical fiction fans of the show because you keep recommending books to me. And I'll let you in on a secret. I usually don't read historical fiction. However, recently I read a book that had me thinking about paternal influences, leadership, war, and love. G'day, listeners, and welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. I'm your host, Mick, and I am probably the humblest host of a show named after a 19th century theorist. However, that's enough about me. I want to say thank you to all my subscribers and supporters out there who are joining the network, supporting the show, and those who have been supporting us on social media. It's great to see, and thank you to those people getting along to iTunes. We are sitting in the top 200 in most English-speaking countries for politics, which is great because I wouldn't necessarily classify this as a politics show, but I obviously clicked that when I hit the categories before I knew what I was doing. So it's great to see. And as you all know, I believe war is just a function of politics, probably the most horrible one. And therefore, I guess we kind of belong in that area. Now, I talked about war, love, and historical fiction, which may be a little bit different than what most listeners are used to. And I know that a lot of you know I'm not an expert in this area. So I got a guest in. My guest today is Nigel Featherstone. He's an Australian writer who has been published quite widely, and his works include the story collection Joy, his debut novel Remnants, and The Beach Volcano. The Beach Volcano is the third in a series of novellas. He also wrote the libretto for The Weight of Light, a contemporary song cycle that had its world premiere in 2018. He has held residencies at Verona, London and UNSW Canberra at the Australian Defence Force Academy. And we're here to discuss his latest book, Bodies of Men. Nigel, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Mick.
Now, Nigel, before we start discussing the Bodies of Men and Australian war literature, I'm interested to know, and therefore my listeners have to be interested, or at least they have to persist with pretending to be interested, what motivated you to become a writer?
Good question. I think it's something that I've always done. I did it as a kid. I was lucky enough to go to a school in Sydney where we had a lot of creative writing. I think we had weekly double creative writing period, which is pretty amazing. And I just loved it. I would the teacher would just say write a story, and so we would all just write stories. And I wrote them, by hand, obviously. And they just were terrible stories. I got two older brothers, so they would have been about, we went to the beach and caught a jellyfish or something. But we'd get to the end of the double period, and my friends would go, "Oh, I've written a paragraph, or I've written a couple of sentences," and they'd turn to me and they'd go, "What have you written?" And I'd go, "Oh, like 15 pages." And I just loved it, and obviously it was complete rubbish, but and really, 40 years later, I still write everything in a pad. Bodies of Men was written longhand, and I'm still just sitting down at my desk with a pad, and I just write stories.
Wow, interesting that you write them by hand in the modern era as well. I do use an Apple Pencil on my iPad, so I like to think that I'm the bridge between troglodytes such as yourself and the new techno human 2.0s. Now, we're talking about your book, Bodies of Men, which is set in the Second World War, and it tells the story of two very different soldiers, in a way, two very different leaders. Are you able to give our listeners a spoiler-free, because we do want them to run out and buy the book, or at least access it through the ACT library system or the library system wherever our listeners are? That's how I did it. But are you able to give us a spoiler-free rundown on the book?
Yes, sure. So it's set in 1941. Two young Australian men, James and William, both from Sydney, but different parts of Sydney. One's very wealthy and conservative. The other one was raised by a single mum and grew up in her shop. and her sort of family very much involved in the peace movement. And that's James. William very much comes from, went through Boys Brigade. His father was in the army in the First World War. William did school cadets. And so they did actually have a bit of a close, intimate friendship in their teenage years, just briefly, and then they meet up again when they're in Egypt, serving in 1941. And they have very different experiences. There is a stoush right at the very beginning, which is actually based on it's inspired, very loosely inspired by a real stoush. William ends up looking after a dump for the army, and James ends up having a motorbike accident and ends up being looked after by a German Jewish family in Alexandria, and the narrative sort of spirals from there.
Now, parts of this book that I loved, having been travelled throughout Egypt and having a lot of the action take place in Alexandria, but also seeing the desert and the desert dump and the boredom the soldiers experience there. And you also mentioned that you open with a stoush, and I've got to say to those listeners who are serving or have served, it's quite you'll be familiar with the stoush even though you've never read the book before, because it kind of feels like most of the contacts you've ever been in, which is quite good and sometimes quite a challenge for writers to do. So you obviously had some great advisors on the book. But in the book, you explore masculinity and leadership through the prism of war service, or I suppose the war is the environment that William and James find themselves in, and by exploring their characters, understanding masculinity, and also different ways that a leader can be perceived throughout the book. Why did you choose the Second World War as the setting for the book?
Yeah, great question. I should say the novel started out when I was a writer-in-residence at UNSW Canberra, which is, as you mentioned, where Australian Defence Force Academy is, and I was there in 2013 for 3 months. And actually, a friend sent me the link to apply to the residency, and I actually thought, why would I go there? I love residencies, but I thought, why would I go to essentially a military campus? So I actually rejected the idea. And then I saw the link again, and I thought, maybe I should think about it. And I was at this period of my life where I wanted to do things where I'd normally say no. I was trying to tell myself to say yes. So I looked at it and I thought, well, if I was going to get this residency, what would I study? And so I wanted to study different expressions of masculinity under extreme military pressure. I don't know why, but I ended up being offered the residency. So a few months later, there I was in the Academy Library, which, is one of the best military libraries in the world. And so I just had a room in the library, and I just wandered up and down the stacks for the first few days. And I was completely all at sea. In fact, I wrote in my diary, I don't know what I'm doing here, and I shouldn't have been given this residency. And I still had that idea of I wanted to explore different expressions of masculinity and extreme military pressure. But I was completely open, because I thought, is it a Vietnam story? Is it an Afghanistan story? Is it a First World War story? I was pretty sure it was never going to be a Gallipoli story, only because it's sort of been, done a lot and explored a lot. But within the Second World War, where would I end up? And there were two books that one of the great things about being in the library is that I like pulling off things about Rommel's strategy, strategic genie or something, and I'd start reading it and I'd go, I'm just completely bored. I really don't care. Or why this particular tank turned the tide in 1942, and I wasn't really interested in any of that whatsoever. Anything that had guns and planes and tanks on it, I tried to be interested, but I just really wasn't. So I actually thought maybe I should give back the residency. But then two books just almost literally just fell off the stacks. And one was Deserter, A Hidden History of the Second World War by Charles Glass. And in that he tracks 3 deserters, 2 US Marines and 1 British. And it's a remarkable 3-way biography about these men and their experiences. And that really illuminated me about desertion and how complex it was. How sometimes the men, if they had great leaders that were basically father figures. They could do amazing things, but if they really didn't believe in the power structures and the leadership, they just didn't want to do it. And one guy actually ends up with the French underground, and he was quite happy to do reconnaissance and blow up bridges, but he couldn't do anything human to human. And his commander in the French underground said, look, you've really got to go back to the US Army. So this guy just literally walked straight into the nearest US Army jail. And what was just amazing about how in various situations, they could do extraordinary things, and others, just the belief completely disappeared. The other book that, and this actually does jump back to the First World War, was Bad Characters, Sex, Crime, Mutiny, Murder, and the Australian Imperial Force by Peter Stanley. And he'll be known to many Australian military readers. For 30 years, he was the chief historian at the Australian War Memorial. And Peter actually won, was co-winner of the Prime Minister's Prize in 2011 for this book. And basically what Peter does is he just goes into all 100, I think it's 100 service, mostly men, where their file is marked character bad. And he just goes into all sorts of things, whether it was sexual misdemeanors or, thieving or insubordination or drunken disorderliness or desertion, or sometimes they were discovered to be Indigenous. So, of course, their files were marked character bad. And once I found those two books, I thought, I think that's what I want to write about. I actually want to write about people who are doing bad stuff, including desertion, including sexual misdemeanors. But as a funny little aside, I read Peter's book and I went, oh my God, okay, now I know what I'm writing about. And then literally, I think it was a day or two later, I just got this email, and the title said Cooee, and then underneath it said, hi Nigel, I believe that you're the writer in residence this year. Just would let you know that you're welcome to pick my brains anytime. Regards, Peter Stanley. And I actually had no idea. So the next minute I went, right, oh my God, where are you? And he goes, oh, just down the corridor. So the next minute we're having coffee with the guys, writing the book. So then Peter became a real sounding board, and he sort of became the advisor to the book. So that was a very long-winded thing. So and that's once I got there, I thought, no, I'm going to write about the Middle East, and particularly sort of around 2013. There's obviously still a lot of stuff going on, and I learned. I mean, obviously Australia's been in the Middle East for 120 years. So with a lot of stuff going on in Syria at the time, I thought, I'm going to set my story there, and that's where we ended up in Alexandria in the Western Desert,
which is a wonderful city to be in. So I implore any listeners to go visit Alexandria, particularly Australian listeners. If you want to see some of the Australian history from the Second World War, there's some great stuff on exhibit out near El Alamein as well. I actually think the Australian War Memorial is a partner of the display out there. And of course, Peter Stanley, a lot of our listeners either know Peter or know of Peter, who's still at UNSW Canberra, and is doing some quite vocal advocacy on the future of the War Memorial, which there's a lot of dissension in Australia about that. And this show tends to be bipartisan, but $500 million on more displays is a hard ask, I think, for anyone. So it's good to see Peter being quite active in that debate. Now, tied closely to the experiences of men in war is the concept of leadership, and we talked a little bit about that before, and you mentioned a little bit about character when you were talking about the two books, Deserter and Bad Characters, that informed your book, Bodies of Men. Now, in Bodies of Men, we see two very different leaders in Williams and James. Now, for listeners, I implore you to go out and read this book. I think it belongs on any service chief's reading list, because it's not the true leader in the book is not the one who has the rank. And many of us who have served know that, but it is good to see it and understand how it's expressed, and also understanding the way that a leader can be set up more so as a manager, because they don't have that ability to lead sometimes. So it's very, very interesting understanding the two different characters, how they go through. But both of these characters have, I'll say, tumultuous relationships with their fathers. James being all but brief, and William and his father, quite an interesting dynamic there. Now, how did the examples set by their fathers influence each of the characters in their conduct during the war?
Yeah, and thanks for your sort of coming back to that issue of leadership, because you're the first person in a lot of conversations I've had about the book who's actually raised that. So that's really fascinating. It's got me thinking. In a way, James and William is me split in two. There's a part of me. I mean, I've never served, and so this is just me imagining things. And there's a part of me that thinks, put me in a situation that's incredibly dangerous and I would be able to respond. There's another part of me that thinks I would run a mile. I would just drop the gun and run a mile backwards. And I really don't know which one I would actually do when pressed. And maybe lots of people don't know what they would do when they're pressed. So I kind of split myself and then push that, and kind of, as what novelists do, sort of exaggerate a bit. So I did create William as having the pedigree. His elder brother is actually serving. His father served, as I mentioned. His father's also a politician. He's got that really strong, strong in inverted commas, Australian masculinity. And I was really surprised how many servicemen in an era went from boys' brigade to cadets to serving. I found that was really new to me. And so for William, he was about impressing his father to be the great server. One thing that's not mentioned in the book is that I understand that Duntroon during the Second World War did actually have a fast-track officer training program at the Victoria Barracks, which I did go to, and that was taken out for just various reasons, but that's what I kind of imagined that James would go straight into, do that fast-track course and then end up as an officer. And then, but with James is actually really quite effeminate, sort of thoughtful. He's very close to his mother. As I said, his mother came from the Women's Peace Network. His father was a unionist, and without spoiling the story, yes, James had a very brief relationship with his father. And so I think that one of the things that a lot of readers have got out of the book is actually that the men are quite screwed up, but the women are very, very strong. And there's actually a third character, which is Yetta, who sort of rescues the boys in more ways than one. And probably that sort of reflects my life. Not that my father served, my grandfather served in the First and Second World War, and then I have a cousin who went through ADFA as well. But my father was an artist and a very gentle man, so he's nowhere at all anything like James or William's fathers. But my mother was very strong, and there's a lot of very strong women in my family. So I think a lot of it is actually about mothers and sons, as it is much about mothers and fathers and sons. But I should tell you, because I think this is really important, that when I was writing this, Tony Abbott was actually Prime Minister. And so he was doing his, I'm going to shirt front Putin kind of stuff. And, that type of masculinity, that Australian masculinity that he was kind of, trying to sort of, promulgate, I guess. And it's just not the Australian masculinity that I find, particularly appealing. But also around that time, there were a number of prominent Australians, two of which you would know who they are, where they criticised Anzac Day, and one of them was literally kicked out of the country and the other one lost his job. So I do worry that we've got to a point where we can't even have any kind of nuanced, thoughtful, informed, educated discussions around things like Anzac Day, which is why I think Peter's book, Bad Characters, is actually so important. Because he, as Peter says, an army is just a reflection of the community that created, the society that created it. So, of course, we're going to have a diversity of people in these organisations. So, that was a bit of a ramble, but I think you're right. It was very much about, I guess, when we have if our dominant myth is Anzac Day, what does that say about what men can and can't and should not be in Australia? And I think it's very limited and probably very dangerous.
It's good that you've gotten onto the Anzac mythology or mythos, because a lot of listeners know my personal criticism views on Anzac Day. I come from the benefit, I suppose, of having served. And, this show, we very much talk about the idea of commemoration and not celebration. And there's a turning point, I think, Australian society went through in the 1990s, where we've gone in a direction that may not necessarily be healthy, for an understanding of who we are and also how we project ourselves backward. The popular term "sons of Anzacs" links you very strongly to that type of masculinity that is perceived, but may not also have been there in the first place in certain ways as well. And for listeners who do want to check out Nigel's father's artwork, he puts them on his Twitter feed quite a bit. So I'll give you Nigel's Twitter address at the end of it, because there's some absolute cracking painting out of a bloke who's in his 90s at the moment. So he's doing quite well. Now, I was thinking of bridging, because there's only a correlation that you just came to me as you were talking, was D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers and Bodies of Men, and the relationships of the mothers and the sons. But we don't have time for that, because I'm hoping I'll get an equal ramble out of you for the next questions. So we'll keep on with the show, but I'll just lock it away to harass you at some point off air on another day about any Lawrence influences on your work. But you mentioned that you worked with some historians and some academics in the writing of this book. You were at UNSW Canberra, where I spend my work week, and I get lost in that library quite a bit. And myself and my co-host from another show, War for Idiots, we did the creative writing courses at UNSW Canberra when we were undergrads, and our listeners suffer for it now. But are you able to explain to our listeners how the collaboration influenced the work, and how that relationship with people helping you understand things that you as a creative professional didn't have the background in?
Yeah, and also I'm not. I mean, the book is the novel was longlisted for the 2020 ARA Historical Novel Prize, which was a real surprise, a real treat, to be honest. But I'm not a historical novelist. I'm really just a writer. I'm primarily a fiction writer, but I've done a lot of stuff, a lot of journalism and short stories and novellas, and yes, writing for the stage now. So I just sort of approached it as what if I wrote about war, what would it be? And two, what if we had these two characters and who were going to act badly, and I wanted to explore what that meant to act badly in war. And so really the first few drafts, and a lot of people don't believe this, but it is actually factually true. I did 40 drafts of Bodies of Men, 37 to get it to the point a publisher was interested, and then 3 during the production side. And so really I just start with, I think fiction is close to dream, and I just start somewhere and just write. And obviously I read a lot, and I watched a lot, and one of the great things about the War Memorial, Australian War Memorial, is able to watch footage that, like William in the novel actually has a handheld camera, so I'm able to go to the Australian War Memorial or watch it even online and watch what a soldier in 1941 was filming. So that was really fascinating. So I just go into it as I just dream this story up. I dream these characters up, a lot of based on history, but it's quite a messy process. I just wrote a draft, and there were originally 4 storylines, and then I brought that down to really 1 through the redrafting process. And then I would, like in the first few drafts, I would just have a gun. I just didn't even know what sort of gun it would be. I would think, I'll worry about that later. So a lot of, and then sometimes, some things, I'd find out what sort of gun they would have, and then I think, oh, damn, now I've got to fix a whole heap of stuff. But so it is a bit messy, but I just start with this directed dream and then just write my way into it, and everything has to come from the characters. But having said that, yeah, there were 2 memoirs that did inform the book. And one of the things I found with these memoirs is that it was quite interesting because they actually had almost no war in it. In fact, one of them said, if you expect me to write about it, and these were written by servicemen, obviously, and they'll publish in like 42, 43 when they come home. And they said, if you want, a memoir with great action, one of them said something like, I think I may have seen a German once, or it may have been a mate, I'm not sure. That's all his action. And another one just said, look, we had this little stoush on our way, and in fact I think it was in the way to Damascus, and he said that was it. We didn't see anything. And of course a lot of the men in the Middle East were just doing a lot of training, and they were getting frustrated, and they would rather come back to the Pacific where they could put some of that training in action. So yeah, so I did a lot of stuff, and then there was a lot of, and then starting to pick people's brains like Peter Stanley, and saying, look, how would this work? And sometimes he'd say, look, I'm not really sure that is feasible. I don't think I've mentioned this before, but the book actually originally was set in Syria and Haifa, so in Palestine. And it was actually Peter's suggestion that we just move it south to Alexandria. So that was an example of that kind of collaboration. Originally, William was looking after a sort of pure training camp because that came from one of the memoirs. Peter thought that was probably historically pushing a little bit because William is very young. So we ended up setting up as a supply dump that William just thinks, well, I'm not going to sit around doing nothing, so I'll start getting the, shoot stuff, as in, birds and donkeys and bottles and stuff. And then there was a lot of stuff like originally, because there's a fair bit of German, there's a bit of Yiddish, there's a bit of Italian. I did just use Google Translate in those just to get the words on the page, and then I had to go back and actually fix some of that and get speakers. There's a bit of Arabic, so I actually went to a Palestinian woman who lives in Haifa and actually asked her over Facebook actually to help me with my Arabic. But that was really interesting because they don't just fix the grammar, they go, who's the character, what education do they have, what's the point of the scene, what's the nuance here, and sometimes they'd give me 5 or 6 different translations to work on it. Peter actually saw quite a late draft, and he had major, like I've still got it in my writing room. I printed out the draft, and then it's probably got 100 sticky notes on it. Things like I had black, the officers had black shoes, and he said that it was brown shoes. There's a bit of military police action in the book. So I spoke to a Canberra guy who's really good on military police and getting that stuff right. So I was really determined that anyone who was really, really good on history I would con them basically that I knew what I was doing. But a lot of that was asking, and often really, basic, questions, things like, there were separate cameras in 1941. So there's just a handheld camera. I didn't realise that the servicemen were really encouraged or discouraged to keep diaries. So James does, but he has to keep it. William does, but he has to keep it hidden. So there's a lot of, and that does change stuff. And then it goes through the editorial process through a major publishing house like Hachette. They want various things to happen as well. And because by the time it gets to that stage, they're just interested in engaging readers. They don't really care about the history side of things. They just want a great yarn. Yeah.
And I mean, the readers and listeners of this show who read the book, you'll find a lot of them are interested in history or know about it. And listeners, you'll find that the expert advice has been well used. Myself, I mentioned before, I spent some time in Egypt. That was going there as part of a language course. So having spoken both modern Standard Arabic, but also some colloquial, the Egyptian colloquial Arabic. I was like, well, he's actually spoken to someone who speaks Arabic in here. So it was great to sort of understand how those details are developed, because those sorts of things they help the engaged reader just a little bit more. And I think you'll probably find people going to their phones and checking stuff on Google. And then if you do notice anything that you don't agree with, listeners, it's fiction, so get over it. Now, this book, above all, is a love story. Now, I'm not one who generally reads too many love stories. I read this as part of my book club, which was excellent recommendation. I can say it's probably the best love story I've ever read, unless you count Frodo and Sam from The Lord of the Rings. But this is one I think that some readers might find challenging, particularly because the mainstay of non-fiction and fiction surrounding the wars of the 20th century, either, I'm going to use the term whitewash here, and my listeners understand what I'm talking about. They ignore or they whitewash homosexual relationships, as we know that was actually quite prevalent during both conflicts. And I guess my question for you is how challenging was it to write, knowing that there's been this purposeful ignorance, I suppose, of homosexual relationships whenever someone talks about, particularly those two conflicts. How challenging was it to write this as a love story in a genre and topic area that is quite often used not just to highlight, but to try and reinforce what some believe to be the desired heteromasculine norm?
Yeah, there's quite a few layers to that question, and one is writing a love story actually turns out to be very difficult. It's, all of us, most of us have had relationships of one sort or another, and romantic relationships, and they're actually quite messy, aren't they? They do this and then that, and that falls apart, and then that happens, and then there's a surprise there, and then bad communication, and then something amazing happens, and blah blah blah. But to write actually a love story, and for people who read earlier drafts, they said, look, there's a lot of stuff that's really interesting, Nigel, but the love story is not one of them. So I actually had to work really hard in actually creating, a boy meets boy, boy loses boy, hopefully, or men meet men later down the track. One of the other books that was really important to me was We Were There by John Barrett, and I think it was published in the mid-'80s, which summarises written surveys with 3,500 servicemen from the Second World War. And that was really fascinating too, just about relationships. And I found a whole heap of things were really interesting. One is they said, look, if you thought we were acting really badly, we really just wanted a beer, a movie, and a very good snooze. That was what they wanted. And they thought that, they really didn't get, maybe some of them had lost their virginity one way or the other, but really they were just too exhausted to misbehave, basically. So I found a lot of that really interesting. But I didn't want to sort of do a bit of historical revisionism, but I also thought a couple of things. I think he's at a million men, Australian men served in the Second World War, which is pretty extraordinary. Not all the interactions would have been heterosexual. I think we know that. Patrick White, the great Australian novelist, met his partner Manly in Palestine in 1941, and then they were together for the rest of their lives back in Sydney. So there are incidences, but I just wanted to go back, and I hope this is interesting to people, because I want to go back and quote almost verbatim from Bad Characters, and because it's written by Peter, we know that it's all based on great history and great research. And if I can, I just want to read this out, and it's only a paragraph, if that, but and Peter says on page 143 about characters, although almost entirely hidden, it is clear that some AIF soldiers lived as gays within the force. The records of their offences give us partial insights into their experiences. Thomas Chilton was a 35-year-old Scottish-born contractor who enlisted in Melbourne at the war's outbreak, 1914. A former British regular, his experience made him valuable as a member of the Army Service Corps. He was wounded on Gallipoli, but also faced a charge of stealing and receiving stolen goods from his supply dump, though his 6-month sentence was remitted after a week. His skills in provisioning gained him promotion to quartermaster sergeant, then commissioned as quartermaster in several battalions. Like other homosexual soldiers encouraged, that's Peter's quote, to transfer, Chilton did not make any one unit his home. At Dinant, which is in Belgium, on Christmas Day 1918, someone found Chilton, quote, committing a civil offence, that is to say sodomy, probably consensually, with a Belgian, Albert Mandot. A general court-martial on St. Valentine's Day, I'm not making any of this up, found him guilty. Douglas Haig confirmed the sentence of cashiering, but Chilton failed to appear at the dockside to return to Australia on the transport at Catalia. Rather than pursue him, the authorities marked his file no further action. So when I read that, I thought, heavens above, what an amazing story. What happened at Chilton? He just never turned up to the pier. And so I started to think, what did he do? Did he go and hang out with this Belgian guy? Did he stay in Europe somewhere? What did he do? And why, we don't know. We have no idea. And so that's what Bodies of Men, although I then, moved that into 1941. But I started to ask the question, how did that happen and what happened to him? And that was the inspiration for James.
Wow. And it's interesting, isn't it? They pursued the way they pursued the law, and Australia's gone through its own level of dealing with the pursuit of homosexuality as a civil offence, and particularly a military offence as well. I mean, I grew up in Tasmania where it was a civil offence until 1997, which it's quite terrible when you think about it, because we thought we were a pretty progressive society in 1997. But also, the Australian military has worked to come to grips and redress some of the issues with it. But these people, the description you just gave there, from all reports, a pretty well-performing soldier and officer. But because people like to tell grown men what they can and can't do, his career was over.
Yeah, and Peter also talks about, there's plenty of incidences where a commanding officer would have known that two men were getting very close and actually moved them so they could be somewhere safer, or where one of the couple actually was moved where then someone, worked the paperwork to make sure that they could stay together. Of course, there's also, that was in the Second World War, there's also lots of, horrible stories where, the opposite occurred. And Peter also thought sometimes if the gay soldier was incredibly good at their job, then and what they were doing actually had no impact on their service, then, they just couldn't be bothered filling in the paperwork, basically, to worry about it. So, but I also had to remember that, you talked about Tasmania there, even in New South Wales, sodomy was still against the law until I think it was 1984. And it was also mental illness in Australia and most of the First World until the late 70s. So we're talking about men who in 1941, they would have had no words. In fact, there was a review on the Honest History site by Noah Reisman, who really congratulated me for doing something I wasn't actually aware of, which I never used any words about gays or even camp, because they didn't exist. Even the word camp, which was originally with a K, didn't actually exist there either. So there would have been no language around it, no way of them expressing it. And so they find it in Alexandria, in the context of war, in the house of a German Jew.
Yeah, and it comes across as just two people falling in love, without the loaded context, I think, is one of it. And Noah's work, and Noah Reisman's a historian here in Australia who has done a lot and written a lot on homosexuality in the Australian Defence Force, in fact. So I encourage listeners to look him up.
Yeah, and another wonderful academic is Dr. Yorick Small from Queensland, who's small SMAAL, and he's done his PhD on the interaction between gay civilians in Brisbane in 1942 and the US Marines, and all based on historical documentation. And so he provided me a lot of really good information as well. So, I think I was sort of worried that a lot of people sort of say this just would never happen in 1941, but through Peter's work and through Yorick's work and Noah's work and others, we just know it was happening. So.
Yeah, and I imagine we'll still come up against some of those critics, but we can quite clearly just tell them they're wrong, which is good. And I'm definitely going to look up that work on Brisbane, because that's probably the battle for Brisbane that isn't heard about. And for those listeners who know what the Battle of Brisbane was, I'll do an episode on that, which is where Australian and US servicemen got into a bit of a stoush and nearly uprooted the city. And I think it was mainly over the fact that they were over here and overpaid and oversexed. Now, Nigel, we're going to get to our bonus question. This is for subscribers who aren't cheapskates like all the other people who listen to this show. So we'll just have a quick pause. And Nigel, now we're back with everyone. I have to ask you my final question, which is one all guests get, regardless of whether they're a historian or a fiction writer, or a journalist or a general. They all get the same question, and it relates to our mission on the show to define war in as many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian, himself. So I ask each guest to finish a sentence, and this sentence is war is. So Nigel, I ask you to finish the sentence, war is.
A very messy human business.
Ooh, that's a good one.
I think that, and I really didn't want to talk about, I did mention my grandfather before, but, I was born in 1968. My grandfather died just a few years after that, and he did serve in Europe in the First World War, and then in terms of serving again in the Second World War. And I think that had a huge impact on my father. My father was 17 in 1945, so not that I don't think he could ever have, volunteered, but I think it just had a huge impact on his masculinity. I understand that my grandfather wasn't particularly, he wouldn't allow any guns in the house, and he wasn't a drinker, but he was quite damaged from the First World War. And then I kind of think, then I'm born really only 20, if I'm getting my maths right, 23 years later, and in terms of like, do we carry this kind of trauma? And I think we do know now that trauma does get passed on. And not that I can ever claim anything in that regard. I live, I've spent my whole life in the east coast of Australia, so what a privileged existence. But I just know that, like, for example, my father was told by his father during the Second World War, just going to school in Sydney, that he had to wear army boots to toughen him up. And just none of his friends had to do it, but Dad had to wear army boots. And so I kind of just think, it just there's the sort of the cauldron of war, and then it just sort of just seeps out. And even though James and William, I mean, they do have to kill people, but they're pretty well protected from war. And then but I was really just trying to show that war just sort of bleeds all the way through society. And then as you talk about, we talk about Anzac-ary and Anzac Day, and how maybe most First World nations just blow up their, so to speak, their war myths to really then impose it and control society. It's morally repugnant, I think. But I'm also not. So I mean, I have protested wars, like literally I've walked, in the street with placards. But also know that human beings are violent creatures, and I think there will probably always be conflicts of some sort or other. And I don't think I can ever imagine a time that there won't be, military conflicts. I think that's just idealistic. But hopefully we're getting better at understanding why we get into these messes in the first place.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting answer you've got for the final sentence. You combine two of our major themes that we've had over the past 98, 97 responses, which is the human aspect of it, the societal one, which is, it's the reason for the show. It's all about trying to help people understand war, because most people don't get to. Luckily, most people in Australia, the US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, where most of our listeners are, don't experience war on their own shores, and also the messiness of it, and the trauma and damage it does. And one way I like to talk about it is the cost, the cost in human capital, the cost in potential. Whilst we're pursuing war, what aren't we doing? What could we be doing? Nigel, thank you very much. One, for writing Bodies of Men. It's an absolutely fantastic read, and it's the greatest love story I've ever read. It might be the only one. I've got to look on the bookshelf. Can't look at the bookshelf over there though, because that's my military bookshelf. That's the one that's probably the most boring bookshelf I've got. And also, thank you very much for coming on the show and talking about Bodies of Men.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Mick. You've asked questions that I haven't been asked before, so it's been a huge privilege. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please check out Boys and Men. I'll put the links in the show notes. Go on Amazon. If you buy it through Amazon, through our links, not only will Nigel get money from his publisher, but we will get money from that massive corporation called Amazon, who have made an absolute mint in COVID, so why not send some back to us? Also, check out Nigel on Twitter, @NGFeathers. Quite an interesting feed, especially if you like rural New South Wales. Some great imagery going on there at the moment. In fact, anyone who has this idolising view of the Australian pubs, just have a look at some of the photos Nigel puts up when he's at the pub, because you've got your quintessential Australian pub like the ones I grew up with. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to this show. Please jump on iTunes, give us some reviews, tell your friends about us. We do have episode 100 coming up, and it'll be a bit of a different episode, but we're looking forward to marking the milestone with you. So it'd be great to see what your thoughts are about that episode. Bye. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.